This is not who we thought they were. In every familiar story, there is someone we may have stopped seeing, and grace we may have missed. Today, we are taking a second look at Samson.
Welcome to the deep dive. So today, we are looking at a man who is basically famous for two things: superhuman strength and, well, a pretty disastrous haircut.
Right. Yeah, that's usually the takeaway.
I mean, when we look back at historical or literary figures, we have this habit of boiling their entire existence down to a neat little label. And for the biblical figure of Samson, that label is usually, a powerful hero destroyed by Delilah.
Which is a very clean narrative arc, right? I mean, humanity totally loves a story where a hero's downfall can just be pinned on one specific villain or like one isolated mistake.
Oh, for sure. It's so much easier that way.
It is, because it keeps the tragedy safely contained. It makes us feel like as long as we avoid our own personal Delilah, we are completely safe. But before we really get into the historical record today, I want to ask you, the listener, a framing question.
Go lay it on us.
Think about your own life for a second. Have you ever noticed a glaring red flag in a situation, like a job, a relationship, or a bad habit, but you just kept going, like you were absolutely convinced you were strong enough to survive it?
Wow, yeah. I feel like we've all been there at some point.
Right. Because if you have, then you're actually much closer to understanding the true tragedy of Samson than you might think.
And that is exactly the psychological tension we are unpacking today. The sources we compiled, which are this great mix of historical analysis, psychological profiling, and the ancient biblical texts, they reveal that Delilah cutting Samson's hair wasn't his downfall at all.
No, not even close. She was just the final symptom of, well, a disease he had been feeding his entire life.
Exactly. So our mission today is to look past the Sunday school versions of this story. We're pitching this not as a theological lecture, but as a deeply relatable character study. We're going to track his lifelong pattern of disastrous decision-making.
And we're really going to analyze the absolute poetic irony of his physical versus spiritual blindness.
Yes, the blindness aspect is huge. So to really understand how this guy collapses, our sources say we actually have to completely ignore the ending for a while.
Yeah, you have to look past Delilah entirely and examine the very beginning of his story. Specifically, we need to look at his habitual way of making choices, because Samson had this really chronic, hardwired pattern.
Right.
He would venture into Philistine territory, look around, and basically just decide he wanted a piece of that life. He would see something, decide in a split second that it was right for him, and simply take it.
The historical record gives us these rapid-fire examples of this behavior, too. Like, he goes down to a town called Timnah, sees a Philistine woman, and immediately goes home and tells his parents, "Get her for me."
Yeah, no hesitation.
And then later, he's in Gaza, he sees a prostitute, and he just walks right in. His core philosophy, his entire decision-making matrix, essentially boils down to, I see her, I want her, so this must be right.
Exactly. And what the theological analysis points out is that this specific pattern of, seeing and taking is not a new problem in the biblical narrative.
Oh, right, the Eden connection.
Yes. The research directly connects Samson's behavior all the way back to the pattern of Eden in Genesis chapter 3. It describes the woman seeing that the tree was good for food and a delight to the eyes, and then just taking it.
So the real danger being highlighted in these ancient texts isn't the biological act of noticing beauty, right?
Right. It's not about being visually attracted to things. It's the act of letting what appears good to you completely overrule what God has explicitly said.
Okay, let me pause you right there, though, because I think a lot of people listening might feel some friction with that idea. I mean, I sort of do.
Oh, totally. How so?
Well, I keep thinking of this as sort of a toddler in a toy store mentality, or like a supermarket sweep, just grabbing whatever catches the eye without reading the labels. But wait. Isn't it just fundamental human nature to be drawn to things that look good? We're visual creatures. Why is his seeing framed as such a heavily criticized, fatal flaw here?
That's a great question because, the issue wasn't that his optic nerves worked or that he appreciated beauty. The core issue, according to the analysis, was his arrogant redefinition of morality.
Redefinition of morality. Okay, unpack that a bit.
So, when his parents actually question his choice of the Philistine woman in Timnah, they warn him against marrying into the occupying culture. His only defense is literally, "She is right in my eyes."
Ah, I see.
He had never learned to let a higher authority redefine what was right or good. He was basically taking the authority to decide good and evil entirely for himself, based on his immediate desires. He was functionally acting as his own god.
She is right in my eyes.
Yeah.
I mean, wow, that is an incredibly modern mindset. We hear variations of that all the time today, like, this feels right to me, therefore it is right, or I'm just speaking my truth.
Exactly. We rebrand it, but it's the exact same operating system.
But that mindset brings us to this massive paradox in his life. Because on one hand, we naturally assume that someone who is highly gifted or powerful is also mature. But Samson's personal moral compass was clearly broken, yet he possessed this unimaginable supernatural power.
Yeah, and that's a dangerous assumption to make. It is a critical error in judgment to confuse external capacity with internal character. And to really understand the mechanics of his power, we have to look at the Nazirite vow.
Right, because his calling was set before he was even born.
Exactly. He was meant to be a Nazirite, which was this very specific vow of consecration to God.
Let's actually define that for the listener, because the details of that vow totally explain the trajectory of his life. It wasn't just about the magic hair, was it?
Not at all. The Nazirite vow, as outlined in the text, generally had 3 distinct prohibitions. First, no consuming anything from the grapevine. So no wine, no grapes.
Not even raisins, right?
Right, not even raisins, nothing from the vine. Second, no touching a dead body or a carcass of any kind to maintain ritual purity. And then third, no cutting of the hair. The uncut hair was basically just the visible outward sign of this invisible internal commitment.
So his strength didn't come from his hair acting as some kind of, like, magical battery pack.
Yeah.
The strength came directly from the Spirit of God,
Yeah.
and the hair was just a symbol.
Yes, precisely. His strength was a gift of grace, and it was entrusted to him for a very specific purpose, to begin to save Israel from the Philistines.
But when you actually track his life choices, you see a man who just systematically dismantles his own vow piece by piece.
Yeah.
Long before Delilah ever shows up with a razor, Samson is already breaking all the other rules.
Oh, entirely. The report highlights this perfectly. He kills a young lion with his bare hands, which, by the way, is a staggering display of physical power.
Yeah, just wild.
But then later, he goes completely out of his way to interact with his rotting carcass because he sees bees making honey inside it. He scoops the honey out of the dead body and eats it.
He totally ignores the boundary about touching dead things just to satisfy a momentary craving for sugar.
Exactly. And he doesn't stop there. He throws a multi-day wedding feast in Timnah. And the original Hebrew word used for this feast literally implies a heavy drinking banquet.
So he is surrounded by wine, fraternizing with the Philistines, completely discarding the boundaries of his calling. You know, I'm thinking about an analogy for him.
Let's hear it.
He's like a $1 million hypercar with a massive, massive engine, but absolutely no brakes. Undeniably powerful, but mathematically, it is guaranteed to crash at some point.
That is exactly it. He is a hypercar with no brakes. And this completely changes the traditional narrative. We usually think of his downfall as the sudden cliff he fell off when his hair was cut.
Right, like an ambush.
But it's actually more like someone who builds a tolerance to a physical poison by taking tiny drops of it every single day. Every time he survives a bad choice, touching a carcass, throwing a drinking party, acting out in rage, he takes a slightly larger dose of the poison.
He just assumes his immune system is naturally superior. He's completely unaware that his internal organs are quietly failing.
Yeah, that analogy perfectly captures how desensitized he became. The women, the unchecked anger, the violent revenge, the sources connect the dots here. These weren't isolated issues. They were different symptoms of the exact same inner disorder.
Right, he let whatever he wanted or whatever wounded him dictate his next move.
Exactly. The texts highlight Proverbs chapter 16. He who rules his spirit is better than he who takes a city. Samson could literally rip the massive iron gates off the city of Gaza and carry them away on his shoulders.
Which is just insane to picture.
Right. He could dismantle a city's physical defenses with his bare hands, but he left his own heart completely without boundaries.
Okay, but this raises a serious critical thinking point for me. If Samson is totally out of control, treating his sacred vow like a joke, why does God keep helping him?
Yeah, that is the ultimate psychological trap of this story.
Because the historical narrative shows him getting into these massive self-made disasters, and yet he still exhibits supernatural strength to get out of them. Like, if God is actively blessing him with strength and bailing him out, isn't it completely logical for Samson to assume God is perfectly fine with his lifestyle?
It would definitely feel logical to a compromised mind, yes. The text notes that God was using Samson's disordered choices to create opportunities against the Philistines.
Right.
For instance, after Samson kills 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey, which, side note, is another instance of him using a dead carcass.
Oh, wow. Right. He's touching a dead animal again.
Exactly. After that, he becomes incredibly thirsty and complains to God, and miraculously, God splits open the ground to give him water. But we have to unpack the profound difference here between God's sovereignty and God's endorsement.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
Well, God is capable of remaining sovereign and working out large-scale purposes even within our disordered choices. But God's provision in a moment of crisis is not permission to continue the destructive lifestyle. God provided water because Samson was weak and admitted his thirst, but that help didn't mean Samson's arrogant life trajectory was suddenly reclassified as good.
So he's basically mistaking grace for permission. We actively misinterpret our own survival as God giving us a thumbs up.
We do it constantly. This is where the story really mirrors the listener today. Samson started to believe his own hype. He escaped the lion, she escaped the wedding disaster, he escaped an ambush.
With every single escape, the concept of danger just felt less and less real to her.
Exactly. He likely started to believe that because he always escaped, the danger wasn't actually real. Why would the next time be any different?
Wow. How often do we do the exact same thing? Think about you, the listener, right now. Maybe you apply extreme discipline to your career or your fitness, but you leave your personal ethics or your relationships completely unguarded.
Yeah, just entirely vulnerable.
And because you haven't been fired or your relationship hasn't exploded yet, you assume you're managing it perfectly. We rename "I want this" to "God will understand" or "it's not that bad," simply because the roof hasn't caved in on us yet. How often do you mistake yesterday's escape as proof that tomorrow's danger is safe?
That is a terrifying question. And that deeply ingrained, unchecked pattern of assumed immunity is exactly what leads directly to Delilah. Delilah is not the beginning of his blindness.
No, she's the inevitable consequence of a really long pattern finally catching up to him.
The psychological dynamic between him and Delilah is just fascinating when you look closely at the text, because the tragedy isn't that Samson was tricked by some brilliant master of disguise. She is blatantly honest with him.
She really is. She literally says to his face, "Tell me where your great strength lies and how you might be bound." Like, she tells him her exact intent right out of the gate.
Right. He sees the danger. He knows exactly what she wants. But his arrogance is so profound at this point that he believes he can just play with the fire and not get burned.
He lets her tie him up multiple times with different materials, right? Like bowstrings, new ropes, weaving his hair into a loom.
And every single time she calls in the Philistines, and every time he snaps the bindings. He literally thinks it's a game. He thinks his strength is just an inherent trait he controls rather than a grace he receives.
Which sets up what might be the heaviest, most terrifying line in his entire biographical record. I mean, I want to slow down here for a second, because after he finally gives up his secret and she shaves his head, he wakes up from his sleep. He assumes he will just shake himself free as before.
Yeah.
But the text delivers this crushing verdict in Judges 16:20. But he did not know that the Lord had left him.
Let's sit with the horror of that realization. He did not know.
It's chilling to lose something so vital and not even notice it's gone because you're just so blinded by routine.
He had compromised his boundaries so many times, rationalized his behavior for so long that his spiritual nerve endings were completely dead. He woke up expecting the usual escape, but the as before was gone.
It's the ultimate consequence of building that tolerance to poison we talked about. You don't realize the system has failed until you try to stand up and you just can't.
And the immediate result of this failure is brutal. The Philistines capture him, and the very first thing they do is gouge out his eyes. They bind him in bronze shackles and make him grind grain in a prison.
The narrative presents us with this severe poetic irony here, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The text doesn't explicitly state that his physical blindness is a metaphor, but the structure of his entire life screams it.
The core irony is that the man who spent his entire adult life letting his eyes dictate his path, letting his eyes decide what was right and good, finally loses his eyes.
Exactly. Before Samson ever became physically blind in that Philistine prison, he had already been spiritually blind for a very, very long time. His physical blindness was just the outward manifestation of his internal reality.
So his personal moral compass was completely broken. But I have to ask, how does a man with such a profound lack of self-control end up leading an entire nation? Because he was a recognized judge over Israel.
That is exactly why his story is documented in the book of Judges. He wasn't just a flawed individual. He was a mirror for the entire nation.
A microcosm of Israel.
Precisely. Both Samson and Israel were set apart by God from their very beginnings. Both had experienced miraculous power and deliverance, and yet both were irresistibly drawn to the pagan surrounding world.
Right.
In fact, the book of Judges summarizes the entire cultural climate of that era with one haunting phrase. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes.
Wait, so Samson was explicitly called to save a nation of people who were living by what was right in their own eyes,
Yeah.
but he was leading them while operating on the exact same corrupted vision.
Yes. Thus, he could only ever begin to save them. The deliverer himself needed delivering.
But the historical record doesn't end with him grinding grain in the dark. There is this small, easily missed detail in the text. It notes that while he was in the prison, his hair begins to grow again.
Right, and that detail is not meant to suggest a magical respawn of his power, like a video game character getting his health bar back.
Yeah, it's not a power-up.
No, it's a subtle indicator that God's grace is still operating in the background. Eventually, the Philistines bring Samson out to entertain them in the massive temple of their god Dagon. Thousands of people are mocking him.
And he prays. He's standing between the central pillars, and he asks God to strengthen him only this once. But if we were being totally honest about the text, it's still kind of a selfish prayer, isn't it?
It's deeply imperfect.
He literally asks for strength so he can get revenge for his 2 eyes. He's still focused on his own personal vendetta. So why does God answer it? And why is he remembered in the Hall of Faith in Hebrews chapter 11?
Because the entire narrative is a profound demonstration of grace. God hears imperfect prayers. Samson is finally admitting for the first time that the strength belongs to God, not him. He is verbally acknowledging he can't just summon it on command anymore.
Wow, okay.
And God does not refuse that final, desperate cry of dependence just because Samson's life was a mess. It proves that failure does not become the only name by which God remembers him.
That is actually incredibly comforting. You don't have to have a perfectly sanitized heart before you ask for help. But the sources also point out that this proves why humanity needs more than just a strong man.
Yes, the theological analysis draws an incredibly sharp contrast here between Samson and Jesus. Let's look at them side by side. Samson lived his entire life doing what was right in his own eyes. But Jesus chose the Father's will, saying, "Not my will, but yours."
And Samson reached out his hands, pushed down the pillars, and died with his enemies in a final act of violent retaliation.
Right. But the New Testament texts, specifically Paul's letter to the Romans, state that Christ died for his enemies.
Samson couldn't defeat the sin in his own heart or rise from the grave. But the theology surrounding Jesus is that he bore our sins, rose again, and as Hebrews says, saves completely to the uttermost.
Exactly. We need a Savior who can actually redefine our hearts, not just offer temporary relief.
So bringing this all back to you, the listener, how do we apply this? The analysis leaves us with a very direct, piercing question. Are you asking God for more strength just to accomplish what is right in your own eyes? Or are you willing to let him open your eyes and redefine what is actually good?
That's the real question. And I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over.
Please do.
Think about that quiet detail of Samson's hair growing back in the dark. Think about the dark, restrictive prisons or the heavy consequences in your own life that you brought upon yourself through your own stubborn choices.
Ignoring all the red flags.
Exactly. What if the quiet, unnoticed regrowth of your spiritual strength is happening precisely in those dark places? What if it's there, grinding at the mill, that you finally have no choice but to stop relying on yourself?
That is a deeply encouraging thought to take away. Real strength begins when the illusion of self-sufficiency ends. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the labels you place on history and, more importantly, yourselves. And remember, the next time you see a red flag, don't just assume your tolerance for poison is high enough to survive it. We'll catch you next time.
This is not who we thought they were. A quiet series where Scripture asks us to look again, not at the label, but at the person. And next time, we will take a second look at another person we may have misread.